1 Peats Ferry Road, Asquith, is a construction project with attached terraces, 2 standalone houses and an underground parking area. This is a primarily brick and concrete construction, with the concrete being used for major structural elements like the basement, footings and floor slabs, and the brick used as the construction material for the walls. The elected trade package on this side was plasterboarding, including the process of cutting, joining and attaching plasterboard sheets. Cutting being to obtain the correct size, joining to have a flush wall, and attaching through different methods depending on the surface.
Plasterboards are placed on either timber or steel frames. In this case, a steel wall frame is constructed for the sheets to be placed on. To begin, the frame is set out, which involves lining out the location of steel frame components. The key component to be set out are the tracks. This involves measuring out the location of the track using a measuring tape and marking out the position using a chalk line. The plasterboard completes the rest of the setting out, which is dependent on the length of the plasterboard. In this case, 1200mm wide plasterboards were used, therefore, studs were placed at 600mm centers. Once the position of the steel wall frame is marked out, floor and ceiling tracks are accurately aligned where it is nailed into place. Studs are cut 15mm shorter than the floor to ceiling height, which will allow space for heat expansion. Studs are placed and fastened 100mm from each end of the track and spaced 600mm between each stud. Noggins are placed to prevent the plasterboard from bowing. Sheeting involves lifting the plasterboard off billets, which require 2 or more workers since the sheets come in one large size. As it comes in a large size, it can be too big to immediately nail onto the frame, and as a result, the sheet is required to be cut down into smaller dimensions. The sheet is nailed onto the steel frame, leaving a 10mm maximum gap between the bottom of the sheet and the floor to prevent the board absorbing any moisture on the ground. The sheet is nailed onto studs, and recessed joints are screw fixed at 100mm maximum from top and bottom of the sheet and at 300mm maximum centers. Once the sheet is nailed to the frame, any sections of the sheet that protrudes into openings will be further cut down. The common procedure of setting is applying a tape coat, second coat, finish coat and sanding. The tape coat involves applying a thin layer of compound on top of the tape, which is over the joint in between the plasterboards, and is generally spread 120mm on each side of the joints. Once the tape coat has dried, after at least 24 hours, a second coat of compound is applied to spread 170mm over each side. When the second coat dries, a final finish coat is applied through the middle of the second coat, which spreads 250mm over each side of the joints. After the compound of the finish coat dries, the joint is smoothened and evened using sandpaper to make the wall look as one. Considering the time taken for compounds to dry, setting requires at least 3 days to complete.
As a whole, plasterboarding was satisfactorily productive. The billets of plasterboards and other materials required to complete the interior render were supplied and delivered on schedule, and there were no issues of running out of materials throughout the sheeting stage. In addition, the delivery and installation of steel frame components were completed within the scheduled time frame because the measurements for set out were relatively accurate. This allowed the team to fix the steel frames in position at ease. By far the most productive phase was sheeting the plasterboards. In general, it was all about cutting the plasterboards, nailing them onto the steel frames, and cutting any areas that impeded into openings, such as windows and doors. As a whole, the team was able to work collectively throughout the stages, and this allowed the project to speed up and avoid any injuries. On the other hand, the main productivity issue which delayed the project was setting and sanding the plasterboard joints. The team had to make sure the layer of coats applied is thoroughly even and full, and dry before applying the next layer of coat. A layer of coat usually takes at least 24 hours to dry, and sanding the finishing coat also took more time than expected, as it is extremely important to create a flat, smooth finishing surface. Sanding is also a labor-intensive job and requires a lot of care to avoid over-sanding the surface. Although the setout did not significantly slow down the plasterboarding process, improvements could have been made with regards to the accuracy and time spent on completing the setouts. The accuracy of the setout directly affects the productiveness of installing steel wall frames throughout the whole building. And furthermore, the dimensions of the steel frame components could be a little bit more accurate to allow the project team to install each component without having to adjust the measurements.
Equipment used during the plasterboarding process were a cordless screwdriver, a cordless screw gun, screws, a standing platform, and a saw. The cordless screw gun enables fast, single-handed fixing of a screw into the plasterboard. This enables the plasterboard to be quickly fastened into place. The cordless screwdriver is then used, as seen in the video, to fasten larger plasterboard screws into the material, providing a solid connection to the runners. A simple standing platform is used for access to the ceiling, and as I'll expand on later, is an inefficient yet cheap method. The saw is used to cut the plasterboarding into shape. Not very often is the plasterboard exactly to the required size of the space that it is being installed in. They had not started the jointing of the plasterboard. The tools that they will use are jointing tape, plaster, sandpaper, and a smoothing tool. Due to the gap left between joints, a combination of tape and plaster are used to cover any gaps, screw holes, or imperfections on the edges of the plasterboard. The tape provides a rigid, perforated material for the plaster to bind and connect the sheets of the plasterboard. This is then smoothed over to ensure the plaster has entered the joint. Then, once dry, it is sanded smooth. Job on a construction site, there are more efficient ways of completing a task. In this case, the use of a hoist greatly reduces the risk of injury, time, and the number of workers required. Using 2 workers to lift the plasterboard by hand to the roof while they hold it in place, while also trying to secure it with screws, is a dangerous method and also a time-consuming one, especially with high ceilings. A hoist enables the worker to lift the plasterboard to the ceiling and have it stay in place while they fasten the sheets to the runners. That was used in this job were cut to 1200mm lengths in order to easily maneuver the boards through the site and to lift in position. When these do not fit exactly, they must be cut on site. This leads to a large amount of waste as these small off-cuts cannot be used. The trouble with using shorter cut boards of 1200mm also means that more seams are required to be taped, plastered, and sanded.